Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Crouch, and I work in the marketing department here at Tafelmusik. Thank you for joining us for our pre-concert lecture for the Beethoven concerts. I would like to start by thanking all of our Tafelmusik members for their tremendous financial support. Your annual gifts enable us to continue to bring our concerts to the stage here in Toronto, and welcome everyone to this public lecture. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank season presenting sponsor Sun Life Financial. Now, before I introduce our lecturer, please note that we will be recording tonight's lecture for archival and promotional purposes, with Rajan just at the side there. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our lecturer, David Fallis. David Fallis is the artistic director of the Toronto Consort and the music director for Opera Atelier. He has led the Toronto Consort in many critically acclaimed programs and also conducted major operatic works by Mozart, Monteverdi, Purcell, and Handel in Toronto, and on tour to Asia and Europe with Opera Atelier. David is one of Canada's leading interpreters of operatic and choral and orchestral repertoire, especially from the Baroque and classical periods, and he's currently teaching in the graduate department at the Faculty of Music at the University of Toronto. And now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Fallis.
Thank you, Tim, for that warm welcome, and thank you, and welcome to this evening's concert. Well, tonight we're going to be hearing two major works by Beethoven, the Mass in C major and the Symphony in C minor, which, according to numbering, is his fifth symphony. That's what people know it best as. So I thought it might be fun to engage a little bit tonight by way of introduction in that old last resort of harried high school teachers when they set you an exam. Do you remember those old things where they said, compare and contrast? This gentleman is mouthing the words, compare and contrast these two pieces or works that you were given, right? It was always the sort of easy way out. Anyways, two pieces, why not? We'll do a little bit of compare and contrast this evening. There are some similarities between the two pieces. They've come from almost the very same time in Beethoven's life. They were both written and got their first performances 1807, 1808. We know that Beethoven, of course, was a famous sketcher of materials, and some of the sketches for the Fifth Symphony go back further than that, but it received its first performance in 1808, as did the Mass. They're obviously about the same lengths, because tonight, the first half is the Mass, the second half is the Symphony, and it makes a perfect evening's entertainment this evening. They were both commissioned works, which meant that someone came up to Beethoven and said, please write me a Mass, and I'll pay you. And someone else came up and said, please write me a symphony, and I'll pay you. So those are a few common elements. Of course, there are many differences between the two pieces. The most obvious, perhaps, is that one has text, words, and the other does not. The Mass, of course, Beethoven didn't have any choice over those words. If you're asked to set a Mass, you set a Kyrie and a Gloria and a Credo and a Sanctus and a Benedictus and an Agnus Dei, and they're all there, given. The Symphony, on the other hand, of course, is just for the orchestra alone. And now that may seem a rather obvious distinction, but in fact, as I'll talk a little bit about, it was a very significant distinction at that time, because this is really the period in European musical history when instrumental music was beginning to be the most significant way of writing music. Up until that point, around this time, almost all serious composers, their major works, had voices. Either it was written for the church, or once opera was invented at the beginning of the 17th century, it was operatic. Now, of course, there is instrumental music from the 17th and 18th centuries, but not to the same degree that there will be in the 19th century. And the Romantics seized on the power of what they called absolute music. And amongst other works, Beethoven's Fifth was a kind of herald of what was to come. And as you probably know, there's a great deal of very important instrumental music from the 19th century, and certainly in comparison to religious music, not so much. So that very obvious difference actually is kind of telling, given the time period. But perhaps even more obvious distinction is that we are dealing with two pieces, one of which arguably could be called the most famous piece of classical music ever written, almost, Beethoven's Fifth. Whereas the Mass, not so much. Just to be sure, how many of you have ever heard a performance of Beethoven's Fifth? How many of you have ever heard a live performance of Beethoven's Mass in C? Well, it's about 20 to 1 so far. How many of you could hum a little bit of Beethoven's Fifth? Da-da-da-da, good. Maybe it's even on your cell phone. And how many of you could hum a little bit of Beethoven's Mass in C? One taker. Oh, that's no good. That's my wife back there. And she only knows the bass part. That doesn't count. Anyways, you see my point. And it's sort of interesting to think of why does one piece, if these are both from a very fertile period of Beethoven's working life and both commissioned. Another similarity is we're actually going to see that both of them were first performed under rather less than auspicious circumstances, but that's beside the point. Why does one piece become so well known, whereas another not so well known? Sometimes pieces are overlooked. History, they get into kind of a backwater and they don't deserve to be overlooked. We can wonder if that's the case with the Mass. Maybe there was a fabulous publicity campaign on behalf of the Fifth, which has made us all believe that it's such a great piece. Or maybe it is a better piece than the Mass. Maybe Beethoven worked harder on the Fifth Symphony, took it more seriously. Or maybe it's just a question of taste, that the Mass isn't to our taste anymore. All good questions. I'm not going to answer any of those. You can answer those for yourself at the end of the evening. Well, let's get a little context for Beethoven. He's born in Bonn, in Germany, in 1770. Bonn, rather like it's been in the 20th century, was sort of, punched above its weight. It was not a huge place, but it was an important place. And it was important, just like it was in the 20th century, because of its civic and governmental importance. It was one of the seats of the Elector of Cologne. You probably know that in this time, Germany wasn't Germany as we know it today, or even have known it in the 20th century at all. It was divided up into all these different areas, and many of them had electors who elected the emperor, the so-called Holy Roman Emperor. And so these electors were very important people. And there was an Elector of Cologne, and he had one of his seats of power in Bonn. Beethoven is born into a modestly musical family. His father was a musician. He was a tenor singing in the capella for the Elector of Cologne, and he taught piano and he played violin a little bit. His grandfather had actually been the Kapellmeister, the whole head of the whole chapel musical establishment. His father was also an alcoholic. Interesting, any of us who have had to deal with that disease in friends or family know how difficult that can be. And I'm sure it was the case with Beethoven. Although he wasn't a prodigy like Mozart, he showed musical ability very early on, and of course his father, being a musician, just like Mozart's father, recognized this musical talent and said, we must cultivate this in this boy. So he gave himself some music lessons at first, and then helped set up music lessons with good teachers in and around Bonn. And so much so that Beethoven became an organist at a very young age and played in one of the churches in town. He was raised as a Catholic. And one of his teachers, together with some others, recognizing his real talents, sort of made sure that the elector, who was actually a brother to the emperor, his name was Maximilian Franz, and that they suggested that he should go really to get musical training. He needed to go to Vienna. And in fact, they suggested that he study with the greatest of the teachers and composers at the time, Haydn. So it was arranged that Beethoven went to study with Haydn. His first trip was shortened because of domestic situation. So he is still quite a young man, just in his 20s, and he goes and is going to take lessons with not only Haydn, but some other teachers in Vienna. And he's going to establish himself as a pianist, because that was his great strength, was his role as a keyboard player, and gradually as a composer. One of the interesting things about being a virtuoso pianist at the time was that people would ask you, wealthy people, and there was lots of wealthy people in Vienna. It was the capital of the whole Holy Roman Empire, and so there were all sorts of counts and dukes and princes of various kinds, families who mostly held land and made their money off their land and actually had lots of leisure time on their own hands and became, in Vienna, like today, great lovers of music. And so they would have evenings where they would want musical entertainment, and Beethoven became part of this circuit, playing for people and sometimes composing for them. One of the interesting features of this kind of evening, which we've lost today, certainly, is that they used to have competitions between keyboard players. They would get two piano players for an evening, and they would play some of their own pieces, but they would also compete at improvising. Both pianists would be given a little snippet of music, a theme, on which they had to improvise. It reminds me, the only thing that makes me think of that today is the comedy clubs. You know, you get two comics, and they get told they have to start riffing on, I don't know, the dentist's waiting room. And then all of a sudden they're all going off about and trying to make you laugh about something that happens in the dentist's waiting room. And then they're going off on some other topic that they're given. And there's a winner and there's a loser, depending on what the audience thinks. Well, that's exactly what happened in Beethoven's time. Here's an account written later by another very famous pianist of the time, Carl Czerny, who went and studied with Beethoven. But he relates a story about another pianist named Jelinek. He writes, "I still remember how one day Jelinek told my father that he had been asked that evening to compete with a piano player at a reception. 'We must make mincemeat out of him,' added Jelinek. The next day, my father asked Jelinek for the outcome of the previous day's duel. 'Oh,' said Jelinek, quite subdued, 'I'll never forget yesterday evening. Satan himself is hidden in that young man. I have never heard anyone play like that. He improvised on a theme which I gave him as I never heard even Mozart improvise. Then he played some of his own compositions, which are in the highest degree remarkable and magnificent.' 'Said my father, 'and what is the man's name?' 'He is,' answered Jelinek, 'a small, ugly, black, and wild-looking young man named Beethoven.'" Well, there are many accounts of Beethoven's skill at improvising on what is sometimes the very minimal of musical materials. Czerny also gives us a little more context for Beethoven. Some of the famous stories about Beethoven are based on Czerny's accounts, which are quite reliable. Here's a bit of Czerny's reminiscences about when he first went to Beethoven to be considered as a student in taking piano lessons. "I was about 10 years old when I was taken to Beethoven through the kind offices of Krumpholz. It was the winter of 1799-1800. How I was overjoyed and terrified on the day when I was to meet the esteemed master. Even today," this was written in 1842, so over 40 years later, "even today, every moment of it is still fresh in my memory. On a winter's day, my father, Krumpholz, and I walked from the Leopoldstadt, where we lived, into the city, to the so-called Tiefer Graben, that's the name of a street, climbed up, as if in a tower, to the 5th or 6th floor, where a rather grubby-looking servant announced us to Beethoven and then showed us in. A very barren-looking room, papers and clothes strewn all over the place, a few boxes, bare walls, hardly a single chair, save for a rickety one by the forte piano. Beethoven himself was dressed in a jacket of some shaggy dark gray cloth and trousers of the same material, so that he immediately reminded me of Robinson Crusoe, which I had just read. The coal-black hair, cut a la Titus, stood up around his head. His black beard, unshaven for several days, darkened the lower part of his already dark-complexioned face. Also, I noticed at a glance, as children are wont to do, that his ears were stuffed with cotton wool which seemed to have been dipped in some yellow fluid. Yet at that time, not the slightest sign of deafness was apparent. Well, it's always fun when you read these, what we call primary materials, to sort of tease out what's there. Famously, Beethoven never gave a darn about what he looked like and what people thought of his appearance. There he is, accepting a new student from these gentlemen who come with their prodigy, or their aspiring young student, and hasn't shaved, and the house is in disarray. That's well known, and throughout his life, many other people attest to this. I find it interesting, and of course, the reference to his hearing, which we all know, was that Beethoven, very young in life, in his 20s, started to know that he was going deaf. He tried various remedies, most of them quackery, and by the end of his life, he was almost completely deaf. Something that you don't need to be a musician to realize how challenging that must have been in his lifetime. I like the grubby-looking servant. So obviously he had a manservant who shared his ideas of how to dress. But the point is also that Beethoven had a servant. And it wasn't so that he wasn't poverty-stricken. He didn't live in a house with nothing on the walls, with no pictures on the walls, because he had no money. In fact, Beethoven earned his living in Vienna, quite well. Here's a letter that Beethoven wrote to an old friend back in Bonn, a medical doctor, named Dr. Wegeler. This was written in 1801. So just after this experience that Czerny relates. Now he's been in Bonn for 9 years or so. My dear good Wegeler, you want to know about my situation. Well, on the whole, it is not so bad. Since last year, Lichnowsky was one of these noblemen, however difficult it will be for you to believe it when I tell you, has placed at my disposal a fixed sum of 600 florins, on which I may draw. My compositions bring in a considerable amount, and I can truthfully say that I receive more offers on commission than I can possibly accept. Moreover, for every composition, I have 6 or 7 publishers, and could have more if I should want them. People no longer bargain with me. I state my price, and they pay. So you see, this is an agreeable state of affairs. For example, I see a friend in need, and if the state of my purse will not allow me to help him out on the spot, I have only to sit down at my desk, and in a short time, help for him is forthcoming. I have also become more economical than formerly. If I should settle here permanently, it would certainly soon be possible for me to obtain 1 day each year for a concert. I have already given a few. Only that jealous demon, namely my bad health, has thrown a mean spoke in my wheel. In the past 3 years, my hearing has become increasingly weaker. Again, we tease out his hearing. He's obviously aware of it. Later in the letter, he asks his good friend not to mention this to anybody. One line that when I read this, I thought, boy, what does this mean? He says, if I should settle here permanently, which means that he might have considered leaving Vienna for somewhere else, I suppose, it would certainly soon be possible for me to obtain 1 day each year for a concert. Does he really only perform 1 day a year? Well, what does that mean, 1 day a year for a concert? We'll just set that aside. He's obviously getting support directly from noblemen. Prince Lichnowsky has given him 600 florins on which he may draw. That's a considerable sum at the time. He's also getting lots of commissions. His brother Karl helped his business affairs for a while, and Karl at one point explained how this worked. Especially for these wealthy people, mostly noble men, but also noble women, they'd come and they'd say, well, you know, I would love to have some Beethoven played at one of my elegant soirees. So they would commission a piano sonata or a string quartet or a piano trio. The deal was usually that that person got to use that piece of music for 6 months, maybe a year, depending on the negotiation. And they promised not to give the manuscript to anybody else, so that you could only hear this piece if you went to Prince Lichnowsky's party in such and such a time, and so it was very telling that he had some new Beethoven to play. If he was lucky, Beethoven might even come and play if there was a piano part, for instance. But after that, it went back to Beethoven, who could then sell it to publishers, where he got some more money from the piece. And if he dedicated in the publication, he would sometimes dedicate the piece to someone, and usually they would throw in another 50 florins for having the publication, the published work, dedicated in their name. So he seems to be getting lots of it, and this is in fact how it came to be that he wrote both the pieces we're going to hear tonight. Now, the first one was, as I said, a mass, and this was commissioned by the Prince Esterhazy, another of the very wealthy families in the area. They'd been patrons of Haydn, and they had a tradition that when the Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, when his wife's name day came up, he would commission a mass to be celebrated on her name day. Now, this is not her birthday. In the Catholic tradition, you're given a name at your catechism, and you a holy name, and you often a saint, and the day that that saint is celebrated is your name day, and it becomes even almost more important than your birthday. Haydn had written 6 of these masses, and so it wasn't surprising that they turned to Beethoven when he was looking for another one. So this is how it came to be that Beethoven was commissioned to write this mass for a very specific occasion, and not a public occasion. Not just anyone was going to be in the little church in Eisenstadt when this mass was performed, but it was written for a church service. So in a way, actually, unlike the way you're going to hear it tonight, there would have been breaks between the movements because the service had to go on. The priest would read gospels, and there would be sermons, and there would be the rest of the communion. You wouldn't hear it sequentially like we're going to hear it tonight. At one point after the commissioning, Beethoven must have gotten a little behind on his writing, and he writes a letter to Prince Nicholas Esterhazy. Most serene and most gracious Prince, since I have told you that you, my Prince, have inquired after the Mass which you commissioned me to write for you, I allow myself the freedom, most serene Prince, to inform you that you will receive it at the latest by the 20th of August. This will allow sufficient time to perform it on the name day of Her Serene Highness, the Princess. Unusually advantageous offers were made to me from London, and since, unfortunately, a benefit day in the theater did not come off, I was obliged to accept them gladly. This delayed the completion of the Mass. Then I was struck down with a head condition which at the beginning prevented me from working at all, and still only permits me to work very little. Since people are only too glad to misconstrue everything I do to my disadvantage, I submit for your Serene Highness's perusal a letter from my physician. May I add that I shall deliver the Mass to you with much trepidation, as your Serene Highness is accustomed to the performance of the inimitable masterpieces of the great Haydn. Most serene, most gracious Prince, with respect, your devoted and humble Ludwig van Beethoven. A very different tone, obviously, from his letter to his good friend Wegeler. This is how he had to address the most serene Prince, and repeat it many times. I love the fact that he said, I'm behind because I got sick, and he had to send a doctor's note, essentially. It's like grade 11 math or something, you know. I haven't heard of had to do that for a while. And famously, Beethoven also bristled at this kind of language, but he obviously did it on this occasion. A number of people have remarked that he said he entered into writing the Mass in trepidation because he had Haydn's footsteps to follow in. And it's true, he does say that, but it's a very obsequious letter, so he may be flattering the Prince as to having such good taste as to have already commissioned 6 Masses from Haydn. In the event, the Mass was not a brilliant success. It was very under-rehearsed. Beethoven went up for a few days to Eisenstadt to lead the performance, or I shouldn't say performance, to lead the service, to lead the music in the service. On the day before the service, apparently in the alto section alone, there were only about 10% of the singers. Everyone else was off somewhere and wasn't even there for the final rehearsal. The Prince, in any case, whether it was for that reason, wasn't very pleased. He wrote a letter following to another friend of his, a countess. As you probably know, some of you have read Tolstoy, he makes a big thing in War and Peace. When the aristocrats speak to each other, they speak in French. So Esterhazy would have written to Beethoven in German, but he wrote to his friend in French. And he said, La messe de Beethoven est laide et d'un ridicule insupportable. Je ne suis guère convaincu que l'on puisse la prendre au sérieux. Beethoven's Mass is ugly and unbearably ridiculous. I hardly doubt that you can even take it seriously. Rather harsh words. I think far too harsh. This Mass that you're going to hear tonight is full of wonderful ideas. It's not quite like a Haydn Mass. You can hear elements of Haydn, but you can also hear a great deal of new invention. In any case, that's what the prince thought of it. It also raises the question whether, is it possible that Beethoven didn't put his heart into writing the Mass? I don't know. His friend Schindler said that although he was raised a Catholic, he didn't ever go to church, which he didn't. We know he didn't go to church. He didn't really appreciate the priesthood and all of the clerical doctrines and so on. He was maybe closer to what you call Deism. He often suggested that he found God in nature. He loved to be out in nature. He was also definitely influenced by Masonic ideas of the time, which talked a lot about, as Mozart was. Mozart became a very intense Mason at the end of his life. And it talked a lot, Masonic ideals were related to the Enlightenment and the American Revolution and all sorts of things, and they talked a great deal about the brotherhood and not so much the sisterhood, but I think they meant the sisterhood of all humanity, and Beethoven was influenced by those kind of ideas. He became a little more Catholic towards the end of his life. So I don't think one way or the other we can attribute it to that. It's probably just that the Mass was really written for a very private event and didn't get a lot of hearing in his lifetime, unlike the Fifth. Well, the Fifth. So it was performed in this last letter to Esterhazy. We had a little clue about this enigmatic phrase, one day a year for a concert. Because there he says, a benefit concert. So, at this time in Vienna, there were no buildings like the Kerner Hall, which I will describe as a purpose-built hall for music, a concert hall, as we would call it. There was nothing. Although Vienna was a great place for music, it didn't take place in halls like this. It took place, well, religious music took place in churches, but on the other hand, we didn't have anything like Trinity St. Paul's either, where you could go into a church and perform secular music. Churches were for sacred music, that's all. But for secular music, you had some spaces around the city, big halls in the palace, for instance, but they were hard to get their hands on. It was a royal palace after all. Some of these wealthy noblemen had large enough rooms for pretty impressive music making, but they were private. There was nothing like a public concert hall. What there was theaters. The Viennese also loved their theater, both straight theater and opera. Now, when these theaters were designed for opera and plays, but they weren't allowed to put on opera and plays during the 2 times of the year when the church was in what's called a penitential season, just before Easter, Lent, or just before Christmas, Advent. So the theaters had to close down their regular programming at that point, but they allowed themselves to rent themselves out for concerts. So this is what Beethoven's talking about. You can imagine that everyone wants to put on these concerts, especially at Christmas time when everyone loves a concert of music. So to get a day at one of the theaters for your concert was a very challenging thing. There was a lot of competition. Some of these concerts would be as benefits, not only benefits for a charity, such as a hospital or a widow's fund or for the poor of the theater guild, but also for the musicians themselves. So Beethoven's Fifth was actually first performed at a concert that he himself organized as a benefit for himself. He was going to keep all the ticket revenues after he had paid the musicians and the rental of the hall, and although he probably got the hall for a very good discount because he used one of the theaters called Theater an der Wien, where he actually had worked for a while. He knew the administration. But it was his one big chance of the year to hear some of his music. in a public situation where he could sell tickets to the wider public. So he packed it. On that evening, December 22nd, 1808, not only was the fifth played, the Sixth Symphony began the evening. And he played two movements of the Mass, which he had just completed and was performed earlier that year in September for the princess's name day. You weren't allowed to perform religious music in a secular setting like a theater, because it was probably, the reason was because it was considered inappropriate that you should make money out of religious music. Religious music was for a service when anyone could walk into the church, if it was in a big church, and enjoy the music. But so he had to call, he played the Gloria and the Sanctus from the Mass that you'll hear tonight in this big concert, and it was called a hymn with Latin text. He also played his fourth piano concerto. He played a big, huge solo piece himself, and to wrap up the whole evening, he played the choral fantasy, which some of you might have known, and it's a piece that, the reason its shape is because it has orchestra, choir, and a big piano solo, all rolled into one. It was a very long evening. A few people who were there said it was terribly cold in the theater, and it was just too much. It was very under-rehearsed, because again, Beethoven was sort of footing the bill on it all, so he didn't have a ton of rehearsal time that he could afford. And apparently in the choral fantasia, the last piece on the program where he was hoping to get everyone up on their feet cheering, it ran aground, and somebody, we're not sure who, shouted out, "Start again!" It was either Beethoven or the concertmaster, we're not sure. But in any case, the whole thing came to a crashing end, and then they started it again. So, inauspicious beginnings, shall we say, for what we've agreed is one of the most famous pieces of all times. Well, what makes it so famous? Critics around the time very quickly recognized it for its, what they call sort of the idea that he's taken one or two ideas, including that famous pa-pa-pa-pa, and practically he just takes that and goes almost throughout the whole symphony. If you're bored with the fifth by any chance, play a little game with yourself and count the number of times you hear the rhythm at least, ta-ta-ta-ta. Not just the first movement, all in the second, and especially in the third, it comes back in the fourth, in accompanying roles. This was Beethoven's great strength, was to create out of a musical theme, and this is what the Romantics loved. It's not a musical theme that is tied to anything specific. What does that mean? Ba-ba-ba-ba. Well, it evokes emotions in us. The Romantics love that. But it doesn't mean anything the way a word can mean something, or a sentence, or the way a painting can represent something. This was what they considered music's greatest strength now, was that the fact that music is actually very poor at representing anything. All it refers to is itself. It is a thing unto itself, a very Kantian idea, who was, of course, a very important philosopher at that time, Immanuel Kant. And this was music's great strength, but it's shown at its greatest in what they called absolute music. Music with words is constrained by the words you're supposed to express. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. So you can't just do whatever you want. But in a symphony especially, you can take one idea, and if you could take one idea and build a whole piece out of it, isn't that marvelous? It's like an idea which we look at from all points of view. It's like a discussion with itself. And this was what the Romantics considered the power of music, and Beethoven became, as you know, a hero to them. For other reasons as well. They loved the fact that he wrote pieces for himself almost. That he was an artist who had a path to follow, that he had to struggle in order to write his music. Not only because he was going deaf, he was also famous for scratching and scratching and sketching until he got it right. It didn't come easily to him, the Fifth Symphony. All of these things made the Fifth Symphony one of the pieces that the Romantics would look to, and indeed, he casts a long shadow through the 19th century. And the Mass, not so much. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, but in a way it's more of a summa of a thing that comes from before. The symphony is something that looks very forward and is going to have a great deal of influence. It's telling you, we can all mention many other 19th century great symphonies. How many other great 19th century masses can you name? Brahms' Requiem doesn't count, that's not a mass. Verdi Requiem, that was written for the opera house. Anyways, it's very telling, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why we know the Fifth a little better, because of its reputation in the 19th century and ever since. But I will also say the Mass deserves a really good hearing. It's a very beautiful piece, and I think it's sometimes just the way culture has evolved that we don't know it quite as well as we do. So thank you very much. Enjoy the evening. You're in for a great treat. I heard on Thursday night the orchestra and the soloists and choir are in top form. And of course, Maestro Nagano is a brilliant leader. So enjoy the evening. Thank you.